So I guess maybe we'll start. There was meant to be a handout, but we've had a little bit of difficulty printing, so maybe there'll be a handout that comes partway through. But meanwhile, I can just talk. So, everyone coming again. I can see several new faces, so I might refer back a little bit to things we talked about in the previous couple of weeks, but hopefully there shouldn't be too much dependence on that. So the idea of today was to look at very large risks and to look a little bit at what might represent very large risks really to humanity as a whole and to our long-term future, and also to look at the arguments, some arguments for why they might be particularly important to consider and to consider doing about something about. So existential risks is the term which is used around here, and I'll get on in a minute to exactly what's meant by that. Important subcategory of existential risks are risks which cause human extinction. So seems you can think of that as kind of the archetypical example. It's easier to explain exactly what it means, and it's easier to understand why it might be bad than some other things, but maybe it's a slightly broader category. And I think that they are very important, which is why I've devoted 2 weeks to talking about them. So today is mostly looking at exactly what things people have identified, some things that people have identified that might pose such risks, and the cases that we can make for them being important, or perhaps what you would actually have to think to believe that they weren't that important to focus on. And then next week we'll look at different ways of trying to classify them, to understand them, and also trying to understand what people can do about them and what the levers are that are available that might give us some ways of affecting the likelihoods of different existential risks. So there's meant to be, this was the first bit of the talk is the bit where the handout would have been most useful because there's a diagram. Never mind about that. So I'll draw a simpler version of the diagram. This is from a paper of Nick Bostrom's, Existential Risk Prevention as Global Priority. Okay,
We've got sort of 1 between 3, and there's more printing.
So the idea is that we can rate risks on a few different axes. One thing is what is the likelihood of something occurring, and that's not represented here, but what we are going to represent here are scope and severity. So scope dictates how large the thing that it's affecting is. It might be an individual person, it might be a little region, it might be the whole world. You can break it up into perhaps spatial and temporal scope, but it's not necessarily that important to distinguish. And then there's also severity, which is how bad is the thing. So it could be global, but actually not all that bad, or it can be localized and extremely bad. And so you can, everything beyond a large enough scale is what Nick labels as a GCR, global catastrophic risks. So these are things which are at least global in scale and at least pretty bad. And then as a subcategory of that are existential risks. And these are things which affect the whole of our future after a certain point and are really very bad, and they're destroying most of the value that we might hold. And there's a kind of broad heuristic reason for thinking that we'd care about these, is that generally we care more about things, probabilities being equal, we care more about things the larger the scope and more about things the larger the severity. And okay, so probably the probabilities start dropping as you move up here, but they may not drop as fast as the scope and severity, or particularly the scope is rising. So that's an argument that we'll get to in a little bit. So Nick actually characterizes existential risks as risks. An existential risk is one that threatens the premature extinction of Earth originating intelligent life, or the permanent and drastic destruction of its potential for future, desirable future development. So extinction is the obvious way of crushing our potential for future and desirable development, but maybe we can somehow otherwise get ourselves into a state where we're just not going to be able to achieve some of the fantastic things that we were optimistic we think perhaps otherwise we could have achieved. And if you think of the so the first thing you must say is, well, okay, so you can draw dots on a diagram here. Is there anything actually which populates this? Or and I think actually the answer is fairly clearly yes. We can point to natural events which, if we're unlucky enough, could cause human extinction. So asteroids are the most talked about. It's particularly clear to make this example. If a large enough thing strikes the Earth, we're doomed. I mean, you get up to something the size of Mars hitting the Earth, I think like nobody thinks there's any chance. Now there's a question about actually what size of asteroid would pose what level of risk and the exact mechanisms behind that. But at least in principle, yes, there could be a threat of extinction there. And in this case, actually, yes, maybe there's something we can start doing about it, because, and this is something that actually over the past couple of decades people have started doing. They've started tracking all of the asteroids that we can see with telescopes and projecting out what their future trajectories will be. That doesn't directly reduce the risk, because even if you find an asteroid is going to hit the Earth, that doesn't solve the problem. But if you do find that it's going to hit the Earth, now there's a whole load of other interventions which may be available to you, and the longer in advance you discover this, the easier it may be to go out there and try and change its trajectory. Maybe actually more threatening to us are anthropogenic risks. So these are risks which aren't caused by the natural environment we're living in, but caused by people doing things in some broad sense, in some cases. So we'll get to looking at a few more of these in a little bit, but maybe is the canonical example. This was the first time that we had a realistic capacity to cause the extinction of the human species. Was the development of nuclear weapons in the 40s, or maybe thermonuclear weapons in the 1950s. Okay, so looking at, now I'll just go through for each of natural risks and anthropogenic risks, a few of the different ones that people have done at least some study of. I'm not all of these things, but I can give you a sense of the overview, and I also won't be comprehensive. There are risks which won't be represented here, but it'll give you a flavour for the sorts of things people are concerned may pose risks, mostly of extinction. So on natural risks first, we've mentioned asteroids. Interestingly, if you think, well, how does an asteroid actually lead to extinction? The main mechanism is a large enough impact could throw up a lot of dust into the atmosphere, and that can block out light. And so the amount of dust that you need in the atmosphere is not necessarily that big to cut out quite a large fraction of light. If you think of the amount of dust that you need on a sheet of paper until it doesn't look white anymore, that's the amount that you need per surface area around the planet to cut out a substantial fraction of light. That could lead to plants being unable to grow, and that could lead to massive disruption of our food production. And depending on exactly how long this state lasted for, that could lead to merely a kind of catastrophic collapse of civilization with billions of people starving, or perhaps even more than that. Perhaps if it was long enough, then we wouldn't be able to sustain a population through that. So, quite bad. Supervolcanoes are another thing which people worry about. So we see volcanic eruptions. Occasionally, you get very big volcanic eruptions, which throw a lot more material out than normal ones. There are just a few active supervolcanoes on the planet today. Active in the sense that they have magma near the surface, and it's possible that they will create a large eruption. So there's one under Yellowstone in the US. And if this happens, if it's big enough, again, it's not a supervolcano, it just has a technical threshold, is the right threshold for causing, or actually threatening extinction. But if it's large enough, it could again put a lot of stuff into the atmosphere, and this could create a sustained period where we don't have much growth, as well as it could probably cause a lot of localized damage. Pandemics then are perhaps the most threatening natural risk. So flu pandemics are the one that people worry about. If you look at the UK does a national risk assessment where they look at possible catastrophic risks to the country. It's a lot smaller than to the world and the entire future. And they rate them on their size of impact and likelihood. And on this register, pandemic influenza is by 2 orders of magnitude the single largest risk on that. And this is because we have historical evidence showing us that influenza can be highly transmissible and reach a lot of people. So some influenza pandemics reach most of the population. And influenza can also be very dangerous. So in some cases, in the bird flu, it has a case fatality rate of about 2/3. 2/3 of the people who are infected die. The virologists who study this think maybe there are some interactions between transmissibility and virulence, but there doesn't seem to be a strong principled reason why you couldn't have these occur at the same time. And so you could have a strain of flu which would infect a very large number of people and kill a large proportion of these. And we've seen pandemic influenza killing a lot of people in the past. 1918, the flu killed more people than World War I did, and somewhat famous for doing this. But the case fatality rate in that case was, I think, just about 2%. So we could be probably well over an order of magnitude worse than that. And that's just with the stuff that we know is actually looking quite plausible. So there are some things that we can do about that. It's also possible that, I mean, if it was starting to spread and kill a lot of people, we would take a lot more precautions. Maybe that would push down the transmission and would be able to keep it under control. But there's quite a bit that we don't understand. And although we normally don't see disease, we don't see diseases wiping out 100% of people in an area. In nature, sometimes this does happen. You do get diseases which just kill the entire host population. That isn't a good thing to do from the disease's point of view, because now it doesn't get to stick around because it has nobody to infect. But that doesn't stop it, sometimes happening. So there's a bit of worry about that. We can make some arguments, like we can go and analyze these specific natural risks by looking at their details. We can go and look at how many asteroids are there, what's the typical rate of collisions between asteroids and celestial bodies. You can look at craters on the moon. You can go and track the asteroids, and you can give quite detailed pictures of risks this way. There's a general argument that natural risk shouldn't be too high, which is that we've been around quite a while as a species already. And if you got the kind of event which would wipe us out on average once every 1,000 years or something, we would have expected to see a lot of these, and it would be implausible that just by chance we made it through every one. So you can say, okay, modern humans have been around, well, it depends on exactly where you count, but maybe 200,000 years. The risk, it shouldn't be, and typically mammalian species live the lifespan of a mammalian species is about 1 million years. Probably the rate of events which could pose, natural events which could pose chance of extinction from this is not higher than kind of the order of magnitude 1 on that time period. a year. Maybe pandemics are an exception, because the risk from pandemic is not just a risk of what's out there in the world, but is also depends on the system that we live in and the way that society is structured, which can affect how you get transmitting things. It's also, by having a larger population, we may be giving a larger pool of people for viruses to mutate and increase the rate at which dangerous things could arise. But there are some kind of outside perspective reasons to think while we might be concerned about natural risk, it shouldn't rise to a very high level. And then when we look at anthropogenic risk, we have a lot more uncertainty about what the risks actually are there, but they look like they're plausibly considerably higher than natural risk. Okay, that brings me on to the next section. Most people got handouts at this point. We've got a few. So anthropogenic risks, as opposed to natural risks, are ones where the threat is generated by things that people are doing. With natural risks, we can have quite good models, and we can go and really analyze like the likelihood of asteroids of certain sizes hitting, and we can get perhaps a fairly good sense on probabilities. If I'm talking about probabilities for anthropogenic risks, I'm having to use it in a sense of something like reasonable subjective probability. So not if we take the world and we run it forward 1,000 times, how many times do we think this will occur? And that tells us the probability. But what a reasonable observer should think, given the evidence available to us. Because that's the thing that we actually have available to, and that we have to be making decisions on the basis of. So I think there's quite a bit more that you can say on that point, and I will say some of it in week 7. But particularly when we're looking at some of the more speculative risks, if we're looking at, say, risks from artificial intelligence, which is something that people at this institute do look at. Nick Bostrom wrote a book, Superintelligence, came out about a year ago and has done very well. To say that the risks from artificial intelligence are high does not mean a confident claim that if you ran the world 1,000 times, then in a lot of those instantiations, things would go badly. It's meaning, to a great extent, we don't know, and we should be careful about this. And maybe with future study, we can understand that actually, this looks like it's a fairly safe technology because it's fairly easy to get right. But from our current perspective, that doesn't look, or we shouldn't be confident in that position. And so there's a degree of subjective risk. So the first anthropogenic risk we may think of is nuclear war. And nuclear war has potential to kill a lot of people by creating giant explosions in the places they live, which is cities. But that is not going to kill anywhere near the whole population of the world. We just, even with the large arsenals which were amassed in the Cold War, and they have been decreasing, there was never enough to directly kill anywhere near everybody. So the main, maybe actually just that would cause enough of a disruption and collapse of civilization that we wouldn't recover. The main way in which it could more directly kill everybody is, again, these atmospheric effects, where nuclear bombs might create a lot of dust, of soot, basically, and throw this up into the atmosphere, and this might block out the light, and it's the same story again. It's possible that the risk from this has been decreasing because our cities are, over time, less and less made out of wood. And wood is great for creating soot when you burn it. And so it might be that actually this happened today rather than 50 years ago. You would create less soot, and so there'd be less chance of of actually causing extinction. But I'm not an. This is something that I can repeat the experts saying. I'm not enough of an expert about the actual. Obviously, nuclear war is something that people have put quite a lot of effort into avoiding. I mean, the campaign, the CND campaign for nuclear disarmament was quite a big thing. People care about this. Many people care about this partly because they don't want to die in a nuclear war, but many people have also said that like we really have a responsibility not to let this happen and to try and preserve the planet. So another thing people which gets talked about is climate change. Climate change, as we understand it, is unlikely to lead to scenarios which could cause human extinction. It is likely that it may cause quite a bit of damage, but the projections say probably won't do anything which could really cause an existential risk. But that might be wrong. And there's quite a bit of uncertainty in the climate change models, and this kind of tail risk from having extreme climate change is something where it's caused by human activity, particularly if the climate is even more sensitive to human activity than we believe it is, and if it's just more fragile than we believe it is, and so a small change can engender a larger change and can kind of cascade. That could create existential catastrophe. Other risks which are anthropogenic, I think, are often not quite. There is currently not that much of a risk, but it looks like it may increase over the coming decades. And this is because we see a general background trend of improving technological capabilities, and we're able to do more and more things. And as we're able to do more and more powerful things, it becomes something of the scale of wiping out everybody on the planet becomes more achievable. And so we should at least so before nuclear weapons, we just couldn't do this, and this was at the time a kind of unprecedented technological risk. We should be aware that there may be such risks coming in the future. We can analyze a bit the kinds of things that it looks like emerging technologies may be able to do, and exactly which of those capabilities could increase risk. So artificial pandemics look like one. I just ran through the argument about why a pandemic might pose a risk naturally. And we already have the ability to create viruses that could cause pandemics. So people have published the genome of the 1918 flu virus, and there are DNA synthesis machines where you can send off a bit of DNA, you can send an email and get people to print out a bit of DNA for you and ship this back. Now, you can't do that with the 1918 flu virus because the people who run these machines have some software which scans for these things. But we're getting close to the, in principle, capabilities.
That's just a fun fact. Ebola is published as well, or at least a bunch of strains of it are.
So Ebola is not transmissible enough that it currently poses a risk of kind of wide-scale, very wide pandemic. But it might be that you can make some change to it which would cause that. And as we get more and more technologies, people can not just go and look at old dangerous things, maybe smallpox, but they could also engineer things to be even more dangerous than anything that has naturally arisen. So you can kind of think things are more dangerous as they're more transmissible, as they have a longer incubation time, so that they can people go and spread it further before it's realized that there is a danger, and as they have high lethality. And there is some work which already tries to engineer viruses to increase some of these things. And the reason they're doing the work is to try and actually understand which combinations of properties in viruses do lead to potentially pandemic pathogens that we should be particularly scared about, to try and improve our monitoring capabilities so that we can respond to these things better. But there's a question about, actually, could these things escape from the experiments, and could you, in trying to improve our safety capabilities, actually cause the thing that you're trying to protect against? And this is a live topic at the moment. The United States has currently paused their research into this. They put a kind of 1-year moratorium, and they've got they've commissioned an outside review into how to weigh up the benefits against the risks. And as we develop more powerful biotechnological capabilities, we may be able to do even more extreme things in this direction, and it may be possible for smaller sets of actors to do that. I put one thing on this list which is an existential risk without being an extinction risk, and that's global totalitarianism. So maybe we could get ourselves into a state where it has enough control over what people do that we have no realistic chance of ever exiting this, and it's lost most of our potential future value without making it extinct. It seems like at the moment, although we see totalitarian states, they don't have enough stability that this could really be a very long-term risk. But we are getting increasing technologies which allow for centralization of power. So we're seeing improvements in surveillance technologies. Surveillance technologies might help you to reduce some of these risks. If you're worried about if you're worried about people going and engineering deadly superviruses, then maybe you'd like to be able to keep an eye out and check that that's not happening. But they could also help enable very stable regimes that we wouldn't be happy with. Also, the increase of drones and the current debate around lethal autonomous weapon systems could mean that you could concentrate power very much more in the hands of just a few individuals who really could, who wouldn't need to, no longer need to keep the army on side or whatever it is that. So there's a lot of complicated political questions there, as well as the technological questions. But there's a class of risk. Other classes of risk are that aren't extinction are perhaps that we go out and have a long future, but somehow we miss most of what's valuable about it. And there's just more question marks there, so I won't go into it. Then artificial intelligence looks like it seems that most things that humans have done, which make our civilization today look very different from our civilization of 200, 1,000, 5,000 years ago, are due to things that we can work out. And we should expect that if we're able to build machines which are capable of a lot of the same intellectual work, not necessarily everything that people can do, but a lot of the same important thinking power, then that may have an important, that may play a very important role in determining the future direction that our civilization goes in over the long term. And there are some ways that that could be very good for us, but there are also perhaps some ways that it could be quite bad. So that's a deep topic, and I'm going to go and talk more about that in week 5. Even then, I think there's a lot of things that I won't get on to saying. And on both of these lists, there are several more things that I could have mentioned, and I'm sure that there are several more things which ought to be on the list and of which I am unaware. Now, I said at the start of the anthropogenic risks section that probabilities should be in this subjective sense. It's hard to really reason about actually what those subjective probabilities should be, but you can try to do it, and you can also go and ask a whole lot of different people, how much do you think the risk of extinction over this next century is? And that's a question that has been asked to quite a lot of people, and typical answers are between 1% and 50% over the century. So 1% and 50% are quite different from each other. 1% chance of extinction is significantly more optimistic than 50% chance of extinction. But they're both a lot higher than our bounds on the natural risk. So it gives us a good reason to think that we should be more concerned and put more work into addressing these possible anthropogenic risks at the moment, given our current state of knowledge. So Lord Stern, in his report on climate change, for instance, uses a discount rate on the future of 0.1% per year to represent the chance of human extinction. So that works out as a 10% chance over the coming century. Probably it isn't uniform through time. We used to, before nuclear weapons, the annual chance of human extinction was almost certainly a lot lower than 0.1%. To the extent that it is driven by the development of powerful new technologies, we should expect it may also increase in the future. And then we may hope that at some point after that, it may also decrease, because we work out, okay, how do we actually manage these risks? What institutions can we build to make sure that they don't eventuate, or to detect things far enough in advance to mitigate the effects? So there is a period of risk, and my perspective and that of several other people I've talked to, though I can't provide a very strong argument for this, is that probably the highest period of risk is coming in the next century or two, and that if we make it through that, there's a good chance that we will have worked out a lot of the key things to keep us going, and maybe it will go down.
Yeah, just a short clarification question. And how do the probabilities distribute across the different types of risk? So I don't know, the 20% chance is related to artificial intelligence, 2% to climate change, 50% to whatever. I mean, what is the sort of those expert surveys that you're
there are some
to?
expert surveys. They don't all agree with each other. But I think that...
What is the hierarchy, I guess, of the anthropogenic risks? Is there such a thing?
The ones that people think are largest are nuclear war, and/or artificial pandemics, and/or artificial intelligence. And there's a bit of a debate about which of those are actually the largest risks. I think I know people who are most worried about each of those. There are other risks, I mean, possible risks enabled by future nanotechnology, which may just be a large multiplier on the kind of power that we can project locally, which are also of concern. But that and the extreme climate change and the global totalitarianism look like they are, and other things which I haven't mentioned, look like they're probably, as we understand it now, lower in risk. I don't want to commit to an answer between those three. I can share some thoughts on what makes the different things differentially threatening. There is a serious school of thought that the risks from artificial intelligence are the most concerning and are the largest. And that's a large driver of that is that these other risks, you can paint quite a clear picture of how they can kill, say, over half of the world's population. And then it's much less clear what would need to happen and what the likelihood of, if they did kill over half of the world's population, they actually lead to extinction. Whereas with artificial intelligence going wrong, because you actually have a kind of adversarial situation, it's easier to see how it could lead to total extinction, or total extinguishment of value. But I think that that should be regarded as an open question still. So let's go and look at some of the arguments for, actually, I've talked a bit about the different things that could cause threats. Let's look at how you can argue or why we should actually give much attention to this or devote resources to this. So the notes have a formal argument in section 4 and a common sense argument in section 5. I'm going to do it in the other order because apparently I forgot to switch the order of these. So let's just look at kind of why we might think we should care about this. It doesn't sound that unlikely that we should care about extinction. And so with climate change, say, people often think we should care about climate change because the planet and the environment is a valuable thing, and we have something of a duty to look after it because we're in a position of control and power over this, and both for its own sake and for the sake of people in the future who may benefit from having this around or may be harmed if the planet is damaged. I think that humanity also represents something precious, and that people go and do some fantastic things, and I would be very sad if it stopped being there. I mean, even if I knew I was going to die anyway, I don't care about humanity just for my sake or the sake of my immediate friends and family, but for the kind of this larger thing that it is. And we might think that actually, if we have some control over whether it can persist in the long run, then and it is precious, then just like with the environment, we have something of a duty to preserve it and to preserve its future prospects. And we might think that if, kind of taking an outside view, if the Romans had managed to develop nuclear weapons and they'd then ended up in a war which had wiped out the planet, I wouldn't think, oh well, I think those guys screwed it up. Like, they did wrong, they shouldn't have done that. That was a disaster. And not just a disaster because a lot of people died at that point. If this is right, one question is, well, normally when there's a good argument for these things, we have cultural norms about this. We haven't developed strong cultural norms that say one of the most important things we can do is try to prevent extinction or try to preserve our long-term prospects. And you can tell a story about why that might be, which is that actually it's only in the past 50 years or so that we've had the potential to affect this, and it was in the 50s that we developed thermonuclear weapons. It's more recently than that we've really developed we could have tried to track asteroids a little earlier, but you want computational power to be able to make observations about where they're going and predict where they will be in the future. And you want spacefaring capabilities to give you a chance to act on that information if you get anywhere. So it's only relatively recently in our history that this has even been a question. And it is increasingly, as we develop more technological capabilities, it looks like it will be more of a question. And also a lot of that time was spent in the Cold War. And while there was significant pushback against nuclear arms race, there were also people just had a lot of other pressures on their thinking and thinking they were caught up in this and wanted to have the nuclear arsenals to win the Cold War. Okay, let's have a look at a more formal argument, and I'll go through this reasonably quickly. I spent a lot of time on the other things. I've laid this out as a number of assumptions and then a number of conclusions in kind of increasing strength as you add in more assumptions. First assumption is that the future could be very large. So Toby Ord talked about this last week. He gave some fairly extreme pictures of us going out and perhaps colonizing our galaxy, perhaps going further than that and colonizing billions of galaxies. Even if we're much, much more modest and we assume that we just keep people living on Earth and we only last as long as a typical mammalian species would, and we think we can only support kind of consistently 5 billion people, I think these are quite conservative assumptions. That would still mean 50,000 billion lives of a century each. So that's already 10,000 times as many lives as we have alive today. So that's very much a kind of lower bound, and I would be more optimistic than that. But even in that case, the future's very big compared to the present, and there could be a lot of value. The next couple of assumptions concern, is there actually a lot of value there? Does that matter? I've added in sin for completeness. Human lives are often significantly worth living. Maybe you can have a debate about that, but I think it's pretty uncontroversial, and so move on. Next assumption is a bit more controversial. Bringing someone with a life worth living into existence, or preventing, or stopping them, stopping the prevention of their existence, is a good thing to do. So some people, including me, have this an intuition, but some people have another intuition that actually things are only good or bad to the extent that they affect people who were going to exist anyway. And if you're preventing extinction, well, if we go extinct, you're not really harming the people who would have lived because they don't exist to be harmed, and so it's not that bad. There's actually, I think I meant to mention this earlier, even if you don't look at this very long term, events that cause extinction are very bad just for the people around today, and there are some arguments that we're probably not investing enough attention in to reducing them, just in the interests of the people who are currently alive. But if the interests of the future also weigh heavily, then that would be a much stronger case for prioritizing this area. So you might like to look at these intuitions which say this shouldn't matter. I think there's a so-called person-affecting views. This is been debated quite a bit in philosophy, and it's a deep topic, and I'll just be able to say a little bit about it. But Weighing Lives by Broom is a book which I think does a very good job of discussing this. It is controversial. I think there are several issues with the person-affecting views. So mostly we think we should care about long-term climate change, not just because it might affect us and people who are alive today, but maybe it will affect our grandchildren's grandchildren. But if we do something different today, then the world will look a bit different in 50 years. And when people have children, it is unlikely to be the same sperm reaching the eggs. And in a few generations' time, it's likely that nobody actually would be existing who would have existed in the world where we didn't do anything. So I don't know of anyone for whom they say, okay, well, it doesn't matter then. We don't need to care about the effect of long-term climate change because we'll change who's existing. So you at least need to resolve that. Maybe there's a way to resolve that which keeps this intuition that it's not too bad to stop people existing and stop the extinction. But I'm at least a bit concerned about that. Anyway, I will take it as an assumption for now that it is good to help people to exist if they're going to have good lives, and bad to stop them existing. So that's not a claim that this is the only thing that matters, but just that it's something that we should care about at least a bit. Then we also have to think that we should be at least roughly aggregative, that causing another person to exist and have a good life is about as good, regardless of how many people were going to exist anyway. You don't need to think that that's exactly true, but for the argument to get traction, it has to be that if the future may be very large, then that's very important. So you can try and firm up and work out exactly what the limits of the different assumptions that are needed to get this conclusion. I think that hasn't been properly done, although there was some work in this area. But roughly, if you take these assumptions, you get to my conclusion: A, that the value of the future may be very much larger than the value of the present. And then there's a couple of more steps to get to we should be acting upon this. Firstly, that we actually have a way of affecting the long-term future. Because it might be, well, we think, yes, sure, there's loads more value there, but whatever we do is not going to be able to affect it. We make a change and it just gets washed out with time. Or perhaps it won't get washed out with time, but we don't know which way it'll go. And so in expectation, it gets washed out with time. And I think that actually looking at extinction risks and the fact that there may be extinction, natural extinction risks like asteroids that we can affect, helps show that we can, even in expectation, affect the long-term future. Because there are actions, if we go extinct, we're pretty sure, we're no longer unsure about how that affects things. We know that if we don't go extinct, we can go and have, or there's a chance of having a long and vibrant, valuable future. We go extinct, we lose that chance. And that doesn't mean, that assumption doesn't get you as far as trying to reduce extinction is the best way to affect the future, but does tell you at least that this conclusion B, affecting the future, is where most of the value in the long term that we can affect is. And so that's actually, we should be thinking about the value of affecting the very long-run future. So Nick Beckstead's PhD thesis on the overwhelming importance of shaping the far future roughly gives a more detailed version of the argument I sketched quite quickly. Then I think more controversial is whether you can get to that trying to affect existential risk is the right way to affect that long-term future. It at least looks like a plausible and important way to affect the long-term future, and I think the argument that as a society we should be devoting more attention to this than we actually are is robust. you might think that other routes are washed out by this uncertainty, and that if the future is long enough and there's enough future social change and we kind of achieve valuable kind of technological maturity, we just can't predict after that point what things we're going to do today and how they're going to affect the trajectory. And so it's avoiding these bad states, which are the way that we can have predictable effects on the future. And this leads to the max-ip hoc principle, where maximize the probability of an okay outcome as a kind of heuristic rule for impersonal moral. So I'll wrap up and talk about the open questions that I identified here and invite discussion. Sorry, I went on a little longer than planned, less time for discussion, but we can always get refreshments and carry on talking. I outlined a fairly consequentialist argument for this. Maybe there are other kinds of arguments that people can explore which are less consequentialist, looking at the rights of future generations and whether there are things that we should be doing to respect that. I'm not sure how strong the argument you get in that case is. I think it would be valuable for somebody to put that out. Other open questions that I've identified at the bottom here are just actually, what could destroy us? I gave a list of some things. There were a few other things I know of and didn't mention. I'm sure there are important things that I and perhaps very few people are aware of. And like I've tried to go to some effort to be aware of there's more work that could be done in trying to flesh out these arguments and work out what the boundaries of validity of the arguments are. So under exactly what assumptions are these risks a big concern, and perhaps how much resources should society be devoting towards them. I've included one, what do sustainable trajectories look like, which refers to a bit of the talk that I cut and moved to next week, so never mind about that one. And the last question, what sort of institutions might avert the market and political failures, also refers to something I kind of only briefly touched on, but the fact that why perhaps don't we already see more work to reduce these risks? Well, reducing these risks is a global public good, so if you just go and do it unilaterally, you're only capturing a very small slice of the benefit, both because there's a lot of people out there, also because it's a kind of transgenerational global public good, and so a lot of the people who benefit are in the future and don't get any say in this at all. And there are various coordination problems with that. There are also various problems associated with the fact that there's just a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of things that we can't think about. But okay, let's stop there and yeah, questions, comments?
So you talked about how anthropogenic risks are expected to be higher than natural risks, and you give an argument that so far we haven't been exposed to any natural risks, but wouldn't think that
if the natural risks were very high, and we were only seeing this because we got very lucky, we might have expected our kind of upward technological trajectory to have gone as fast as plausible, because it may be less unlikely that that would have progressed very fast than that if that reduces the number of times that we had to be lucky and dodge the natural risks. So I think you're right that these observer effects do risk there is there, but I don't think it as far as we can't say anything about this. Anders will talk a bit more about observable effects in week 6. I'm not sure who's looking at that question in particular. With the anthropogenic risks, it is... So I think Toby has a draft paper on this, and he would be a better person to ask than I am. I think that we super confident about this, in that it may be that there are good reasons that we just don't understand at the moment that the anthropogenic risks are much lower than these estimates. But while we're uncertain, these estimates are acting on them. So that's the sense in which I'm claiming that they are bigger. I don't think I've given a great answer to this, and but if you can explore this and you can present a stronger case for being important relative to anthropogenic risks, I would love to know that, and I think that would be really important.
I think that's it. I always thought that there might be a bias for anthropogenic risks because humans naturally have a bias to risks that are intentional. Because normally we couldn't do anything about natural risks, and we could do something about anthropogenic risks in the Paleolithic. And I actually have never seen that. That's the paper by Toby, but I have never seen a good argument why anthropogenic risks would be the ones that we should care more about.
I think there's one fundamental change over the last decade, and that's the question of reach, which is over the last decade we should start to be more concerned about anthropogenic risk. Because I mean, you mentioned thermonuclear weapons, but I guess it's in particular with increased computing power, with maybe 3D printing and other things, being able to replicate DNAs, which can then that is something unprecedented. And I think this question of having a global reach as humanity, as really changing the condition of anthropogenic risks and also the capacity of humanity to destroy itself, which pre-thermal was absolutely absent, but the impact was always local, maybe national, not on a planetary scale. So I think the reach.
So I don't think there's a kind of very in-principle reason why anthropogenic risks happen, but I think we can look and say that the natural risks at least aren't that high at the moment, and maybe right now we should be careful in case we're in a world where anthropogenic risks are high, and maybe in 50 years we'll actually have a better handle on this and we'll say, look, okay, we were worried about anthropogenic risks, that was reasonable, now we understand this better, we weren't in too much danger of wiping ourselves out, let's go and focus on these natural risks. But then we've only accrued half a century of the natural risk, and we think that's not too high. Whereas if the other way around, if you make the other mistake, you might think, well, we haven't demonstrated that anthropogenic risks are necessarily more dangerous, let's focus on the natural risks. And it turned out that the anthropogenic risk had was quite high and was like 1% a year or something, and we got wiped out in the meantime. That might be a bad outcome. So I think there's an asymmetry from the uncertainty.
It sounds like you're saying more that some of the risk of anthropogenic risks because we can directly see mechanisms that would cause extinction, but a lot of it is merely a massive amount of uncertainty relative to the amount of evidence we have.
Yep.
The other one.
Is it possible maybe to look back on fossil records of other species in terms of looking at, so I mean, what you were saying is that maybe we were lucky and we just happened not to have encountered anything over the last 100,000 years. But it's unlikely for that same fortune to have applied to other species. So maybe it would be possible to look back on records of other species and see, okay, how often did they go?
That's right, and so that's actually, that was why I was quoting this kind of typical lifetime for the mammalian species of about 1 million years, and that's from the fossil method. Yeah, I think you're right that like at least somewhat applies. Maybe there's a reason we're special, but it's not clear why we should be particularly more susceptible to natural risks. Unless it's something to do with the we've built something in our civilization which now exposes us more to natural risks.
To what extent do you think that an avoidance of these anthropogenic risks leads to a stifling of creativity and innovation, and then a stifling of society in itself, and then that is sort of takes us down another path into like where we then lose value in the future because we're too scared to try anything.
Well, that could itself be an existential risk. I would certainly admit that. I think it is possible that the future could go that way. I worry about that a bit, but I think that it's actually quite unlikely, and that that you would end up stifling everything. And it would be a mistake, and people would hopefully be able to recognise that it was a mistake and pull back. And
because it seems like it needs to be a balance, right, between
I think
driving forward with its new technologies and like nanotechnology and AI, and trying to use it in a positive way while not also wiping ourselves out.
Many of these technologies, it looks like, are going to be extremely important to develop. And both in terms of letting us build a more prosperous civilization, but also a civilization which will reduce a lot of other risks. And so it's just a question. It's a question of sequencing. I don't think anybody would say, "Oh, we should." No, we should never say. I don't think anybody would say. Of the people at this institute who think about AI risk, I think that they all think that AI is an important technology and we should develop it. And it's just a question about the manner in which you develop it. And so hopefully there'll be no long-term kind of permanent stifling.
One question and maybe one comment. The question would be about the sense in which you use the term risk for something in the future that you can't think of as being a repeated event about which you can then have some sort of distribution. So what do you mean by risk? Yeah, I mean.
So this ties into what I was saying about subjective probability. I mean that there is, it is appropriate for us to have a subjective belief that this might happen. And obviously, there's a lot of things about the future that we are just not going to be able to predict. And certainly we can't predict with certainty, but we can try and understand different routes that it might go down and perform some contingency planning that will help us in each of the likely paths. And so the sense of risk that I mean there is if we identify it wiped out by people making an artificial, then from the perspective here, that's a risk, even if actually we're going to go along here.
And the comment, there was just one question about cultural norms, and you said something about, in the sense of, well, we never had the capability, and that's why we don't have norms. But to me, it seems more about the nature of the probabilities, that we're simply not very capable of thinking about, collectively, about low probabilities and high impact events.
Yes, I think this is at least also something which plays into it. I mean, we understand this a certain amount, and we've established cultural norms of people wear seatbelts, which is deflecting low probability, high impact events at a personal scale, and that's easier because it's happened enough that we can actually collect data and do this.
I have a question about the decent, and if you think it's overall good or bad. Because if you consider nuclear weapons, one of the good things about them is that it's really difficult to make an atom bomb. You need like massive, the sophisticated technology and that kind of thing. And you spoke earlier about what if everyone could just 3D print some virus in their homes. But on the other hand, decentralization brings a lot of democratic prospects for shifting power from maybe totalitarian governments to citizens. So overall, is decentralization a big risk or a big positive?
Fantastic question. Like this could easily be on the open questions at the end. I'm not sure, and I think that there's a lot more work that could be done to try and weigh up the different things on two sides here. I think it may also be possible to seek out routes which try and capture the benefits of both sides, and or at least like quite a lot of the benefits of decentralization, with quite a lot of the benefits of centralization. If you just had to push me for my gut feel on right now, would I nudge towards more centralization or more decentralization? I'd probably nudge towards more centralization, but I'm quite unconfident about that.
Could you use something more concrete, maybe?
No.
I am less confident than most people, it seems, the kind of our societal norm. The mass surveillance is a bad idea. I think that it does have social costs, but it may be that it's actually, to the extent that we've seen it over the last decade or so in the West, it mostly hasn't had a serious impingement on kind of citizens' ability to go about and lead their lives and do whatever they want. And it might be that it's a useful norm to have in place before we develop more powerful technologies which could allow for more localized structure. But even then, I'm not sure, and I do put some weight to the argument which say we should be a bit more careful about this. I realised it's 4:10, so I should at least give people an opportunity to go or get refreshments. But I'm happy to chat to people for lunch. Thanks so much.
Ja, ich dachte, die ebenfalls in die also wenn ich glaube nicht,
You're saying like
Sorry.
either I might get them to give another full or
Yeah, what are the other? No, it's but yes, what are the other main topics that are being focused? Next week is like long-term projects.
The next term is more existential risk, and it's about how we can classify them, how we can identify like what the kinds of risks are, and what we can do about each of these things.
Right, and then
week 5 is superintelligence. Week 6, I think, is Anders talking about observer effects. Then week 7 is about great unknowns, like how we should act under uncertainty. Things related to that. And the final one is on differential technology.